Welcome to Think Over Here, the show where we hop all around the world and talk about people, culture, history, or really anything that I find fascinating. It's pretty open that way. And today... Wait, did you hear that? Mystery. It sounds like mystery's calling. Controversy. Oh, and controversy too? Wait, what's that? Cryptozoology. Crypto. Okay, wow, okay. Sounds like we're in for an exciting show. Yeah, that's right. So today we are talking about the controversy, the science, the history of the Kting Voar. Now, if you've never heard of the Kting Voar, that's all right, because before researching this episode, I never had to. But essentially, the Kting Voar is a supposed creature. It's like a cryptid. So think about like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, Chupacabra, these semi-legendary creatures that people believe to exist. Well, that's just like the Kting Voar, except the Kting Voar isn't a giant ape wandering around California, and it isn't a giant kraken lurking in the depths of the ocean. No, the Kting Voar is a snake-eating cow. So yes, the Kting Voar, or the Kting Sipo, which means wild cow that eats snake. That's right. So if you're a snake, you better stay clear out of this cow because, well, you better move on over if you're a snake because this cow is going to come and chomp you. So yeah, so we're going to hop over to Southeast Asia. So we're going to be right on the border of Cambodia and Vietnam, where the Kting Voar supposedly exists or existed. And now what's really cool, what's one thing that really sets the Kting Voar apart from all the other cryptids like Bigfoot, where you have these guys who claim to use scientific techniques to track him down and they have all this evidence. The difference is that the Kting Voar actually has scientific evidence. It's been published in journals of zoology. It's been published about in the esteemed journal Nature as recently as 2002. So we're not talking, some crazy guy you meet in a tent in the middle of the woods hunting for Bigfoot. No, we're talking actual scientists, actual biologists, actual zoologists here who believe that the Kting Voar to exist. Now, although there are scientists who believe the Kting Voar to exist, or they believed, there's also a lot of scientists who do not believe the Kting Voar exists. And today, it seems that the research is heavily leaning towards and it's kind of concluded that the Kting Voar isn't a thing. So, hate to get your hopes up, but it looks like if you're planning a trip to Cambodia, Vietnam, you may be able to find it. Who knows? But it's slim. The scientists weren't able to do it. Now here's two quotes, one from a proponent of the Kting Voar and one from a skeptic of the Kting Voar. And these quotes were taken right around the height of the scientific flurry behind the Kting Voar, right around 2000. So right around 1999-2000, Hunter Wheeler said this: "This is the only documented mammal that we know exists, but that has never been seen by outsiders." And he was a wildlife researcher who was the co-writer of the official entry on the Kting Voar in the Red List of Threatened Animals, published by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Meanwhile, Richard Melville said this about the Kting Voar in that same time period: "This is the biggest hoax, if unintentional, in the annals of zoology. There's no middle ground here. It's a hoax, my friend." Thank you, Richard. So here we go. We see some people who claimed that the Kting Voar was the only documented mammal that we know exists, but we haven't seen yet. And another scientist saying that it's a hoax. And Hunter Wheeler, the guy who said that this is the only mammal that we know exists but has been seen by outsiders, he has backpedaled since that quote and is now much more skeptical of the existence of the Kting Voar. So there you go. We see the scientific controversy popping up already. So let's talk about how this all began. So in 1994, some German scientists, they were researching in Cambodia, Vietnam, and the jungles there. And the scientists, they bought these forms from a Vietnamese marketplace. So they didn't actually see the animal. They didn't collect the horns out in the wild. They simply bought these at the marketplace. And of course, these stood out because they were interesting. These horns, they were dark ochre brown, and they were long, and they were spiraled at the end. They were twisted at the end. And not only that, they had these undulations. And so you can kind of imagine, so like these horns, they look kind of like, how to describe this? They look kind of like these set of discs on top of each other. So like imagine a pearl necklace, you squish the pearls down into discs, and then you lay those discs on top of each other into this spiraled horn shape. So the horn undulates to these thick and thin areas on these discs, but then these discs also combine into this twisting shape. Look up a picture. It'll help a lot. So they got these horns, and they were excited because they thought that this was a new species. And they thought that, so they published the paper, so they published the information about the horns in a paper. They called the new species, they gave it the Latin name Pseudonovibos spiralis. I probably said that wrong, so forgive me. And they said that this goat-like creature, they assumed it was a goat-like creature, lived in the isolated Annamite Mountains of Southeast Asia, right there on the borders of Cambodia and Vietnam. And they assumed that because A, they were talking around to the local people, and B, this was a hotspot of biologic zoologic research where they had just been discovering these new mammals. And discovering new mammals, that's fairly rare in zoology. Discovering a new species of insect is exciting but not unheard of, but discovering a new mammal is much more rare. And so for example, in this same area, they had recently discovered the giant barking deer. So just imagine a giant deer that barks like a dog. So that was over there in Cambodia, Vietnam, and they said, you know what, I bet that the Kting Voar, these horns, these weird undulating twisted horns, come from that same region. Now, don't think I'm going to let that giant barking deer just go off without being talked about, because I have never heard of a barking deer before, let alone a giant one. So apparently all over Southeast Asia, there are barking deer called moonjacks. And they bark, and they sound like dogs. And apparently people say that the barking can be kind of scary at night, especially if you don't know what it is. And here is the lovely sound of the barking deer. Enjoy. So not only were giant barking deer recently discovered in the same area, but what's more, the scientists, they said, hey, there's actually already a study of these horns that were misidentified as Kooprey horns located at the University of Kansas. The University of Kansas say, yeah, we have these horns, and yes, they aren't Kooprey horns. They were misidentified. We agree. And yes, we think that these are part of this new species as well. So the University of Kansas was on board. And we'll talk more about those horns at the University of Kansas in just a bit because they are special horns. So get ready for that. They're known as the Excalibur set. So yeah. But let's talk a little bit more about what this Kting Voar is. So we already talked about the horns, but let's go over that again. So imagine these dark brown ochre horns that are long and they twist at the end, and the horns, they thicken and thin along these discs that are stacked up on top of each other. The Kting Voar is commonly believed to be cow-like, but has also been described as a goat. It's also been described as a buffalo. And the Kting Voar is believed to be smaller than a couperet, which is an indigenous cow-like animal in Cambodia. And it's believed to be blotched, so it has this blotchy pattern on it. And it's said to eat snakes. It's also said, so locals have said that they've seen the Kting Voar digging up termite mounds in hunting snakes. And what's really special about the Kting Voar, again, is these horns. The local people believe that the horns can be used as a cure for snake bite, because snakes, when they bite the Kting Voar, it doesn't even affect the Kting Voar. The venom of the snake doesn't affect it, supposedly. And so it's believed that the horns will ward off snakes, will cure snake bites, and you can even use to kill the snake. If you find a snake burrow and you place the Kting Voar's horns by the burrow of the snake will die. However, you have to be a little bit careful with the horns, because it's also believed that a fresh set of Kting Voar horns needs to be smoked. So if you find a dead Kting Voar and you touch the horns supposedly contain the snake venom. So you have to smoke the horns before you can handle them, or else the horns will make you sick. Again, so when you're picturing the Kting Voar, picture a small cow-like animal with these twisted, undulating horns. The horns are dangerous if you don't smoke them first, and they are a great cure for snake bite, and this is a small, splotchy cow. It's also believed that the Kting Voars are sexually dimorphic, simply because most cows are. So the males will be bigger than the females. So there you go. Now you know what the Kting Voar looks like. So what's the next step? So now we have these horns procured by these German researchers. We have this other set of horns at the University of Kansas. And then during this fury of activity, about 70 other horns were all found and believed to be Kting Voar horns. But during this time, the Kting Voar was never found. Only the horns were found. Now, so the scientists, this is where all the scientific research comes in. So the scientists, they begin to look at these horns. And the scientists immediately became very skeptical, because they found that the horns were artificially made. They found that the horns were actually just buffalo horns that local people would heat up, and using some vinegar and some special techniques, they could heat the horns, soften them, and twist them by hand, and then file down the horns to make these undulating discs. And now it's interesting, because this was not the first time that I've heard about a similar process of heating something up so that it's more malleable to work something that's regularly solid, like cow horns. And growing up, there's this beautiful tabernacle in Brigham City, and we would go there sometimes for special meetings. And inside the tabernacle was actually built by pioneers, and inside they have these beautiful railings, long railings that spiral and twist around. And I remember I was asking about them because I was looking closely at the railings, because I may or may not have been a little bit bored during one of these meetings, and I noticed that the banister, the railing, was all solid and wasn't broken up into pieces. And so I actually asked one of the workers there, and they described to me this process where the pioneers would soak the wood in manure, and then the hot steaming manure would actually permeate through the wood and make it more malleable, so they were able to bend it and twist it and stuff, make it a long spiraling railing. So I don't know exactly the process. I don't know the accuracy of that statement or the process, but apparently you can do some magical things if you heat up solid organic matter with some sort of hot steaming substance. So there you go. Twist some wood, twist some cow horns. Do what you want to do with that information. I won't judge. So when more and more sets of horns were found, and then more and more sets of horns were identified as fakes, started to get the researchers nervous. And in fact, most of the horns were identified as fakes. They had these marks of this artificial torsion process by people, and of sanding and filing and cutting and scoring. So there was a lot of doubt immediately cast over it. But the researchers at the University of Kansas, they really liked their set of horns, and they published papers saying that they believed that there was no evidence of artificial torsion or filing or scoring in their set of horns. And they even did X-ray analysis and things like that to look at how the horn's keratin molecules stacked up in order to see if there was twists or artificial strain in the keratin molecules. And they said that there wasn't any evidence of that. However, other scientists, when they looked at those same images, said it looks like just like all the other horns that were faked. So some said yay, others said nay. So they didn't just look at the horn. They also ran DNA tests on the horns to see if there was DNA evidence signifying that this was a new species. But then when they started taking the DNAs from these different horns, they found that some of the DNA came back as goat DNA, some of the DNA came back as cow DNA, and some of the DNA came back as buffalo DNA. And there is no evidence of a new species in any of the DNA signatures. Awkward. So that caused a lot of scientists to immediately become skeptical. However, the researchers at the University of Kansas, they said that, well, there wasn't any sign of a new species in the DNA because the Kting Voar must have been breeding with domesticated cattle. And so the new DNA signature must have been lost, must have been overran by the domesticated cattle DNA signature. So that's how they were able to wave that off. And so right around 2000 to 2002, this was when all of this scientific rigor was really on fire, was blowing up with the Kting Voar. This was when the DNA tests were being done. This was when the radiological X-ray studies were being done on the horns. People were identifying fakes, and people were publishing all about it in different zoological articles. And at the University of Kansas, they were holding on, saying that their set of horns was the special one. They said that no matter if you proved all the other horns to be faked, that the University of Kansas horns were the Excalibur. That if there was one set of true horns, that was enough evidence to believe that the Kting Voar was a new species. And so the University of Kansas set of horns was believed to be that Excalibur set, the good set, because unfortunately the set that the German scientists collected back in 1994, they had already been dismissed as fakes. And all of this research came together in December of 2001 in the Journal of Zoology, and this was where all the proponents for the Kting Voar and all the skeptics of the Kting Voar laid out all the evidences that we had just described. So the proponents of the Kting Voar, they held this University of Kansas set of horns up in the air, and they said, we looked at these and there's no evidence of artificial creation in these horns, artificial manipulation of these horns. We believe this to be a new species. And then the skeptics said, we ran DNA evidence and we get different DNA signatures from goats, cows, and buffaloes. We never get any Kting Voar DNA, any new DNA signatures. And we've also actually looked at your set of University of Kansas horns, and we actually believe that there is evidence of this artificial torsion and scoring in the horns. And the other thing that they bring up is they attack the pedigree of the University of Kansas horns, because the University of Kansas horns, they were held so special because they had been collected and described before those 1994 German scientists declared a new species. They had been collected before all of this hot new research was taken off. And the University of Kansas horns, according to their pedigree, they were collected by Richard L. Sutton Sr. and Richard L. Sutton Jr. And those two, in 1929, they went to Cambodia and Vietnam on a hunting trip to collect trophies of tigers and things. And I'm not a proponent of big game hunting. If you are a proponent of that, If you are a fan of big game hunting, please make sure that you are doing it ethically, that you get the required permits, all of those things. I don't recommend hunting tigers. So anyway, throwing that aside, this was back in 1929. It was a different times. They were off on their hunting trip collecting trophies. And they had collected this set of horns. And what's interesting is back in 1929, the Suttons didn't believe the horns to be anything special. They described that the horns were probably simply collected not as trophies. They were simply cow horns. And they said that the horns were probably collected from a cow that was killed to be used as tiger bait or simply as meat for food. Now, there was nothing special about them, and that's why they donated them to the University of Kansas. And that's why they were also misidentified as this native Kupre cow, which is simply a small cow in Cambodia, Vietnam. Now, what's awkward about that pedigree is that when the University of Kansas researchers originally published their article describing their wonderful Excalibur set of Kting Voar horns, they left out that word probably when they were describing that pedigree. So when the Suttons said that the cows were collected probably simply for tiger bait or meat, the University of Kansas researchers left out that probably and put a lot more authority on it. It turned out that the Suttons weren't really sure where the horns came from. And if the Suttons were the ones who collected the horns on their hunting trip, but the Suttons didn't kill the Kting Voar, they didn't know where it came from, well, is it possible that it didn't come from an animal, that it might have also come from a market where there are these other fake sets of horns? And the other interesting thing is that in 1929, that was actually the hot period for when most of these horns were being purchased that were fakes. So in the Great Debate article published in 2001, the researchers cite this, saying, look, Suttons don't really know where the horns came from, this prize set in University of Kansas, and they were collected at the same spot and time as all these other fakes. So we believe them to likely be fake. And so essentially that is where the research is left off. Most of the scientists, a lot of them, if they were proponents of the Kting Voar earlier, they have retracted those statements. And because there is simply no evidence of the Kting Voar to exist. And so there might be a few researchers out there that still are on the lookout for the Kting Voar. Definitely most scientists, if they do believe in the Kting Voar, believe it to be extinct because there hasn't been any live species found. And due to all the wars, instability recently in Cambodia and Vietnam, deforestation, things like that, they believe that if there ever was a Kting Voar, that it doesn't exist now. So if you go to Vietnam and Cambodia and you find a cow with these long twisted horns and they're undulating and it's eating a snake, please let somebody know, take a picture, do something, because you just found the mythical, the legendary Kting Voar. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, that Great Debate paper in 2001 about the Kting Voar, was that Richard Melville, one of the skeptics of the Kting Voar, he said that the proponents, unfortunately, may have been misled due to cultural blindness. And I thought that was interesting. And he said that if the scientists had understood the cultural story behind the Kting Voar and more of its mythology and symbolism, they wouldn't have been as quick to believe that it was a real animal. Because there's been these Chinese sources that described in South China this fabled goat-like animal that had these long twisted horns that was believed to eat snakes. And what I love about this guy is that this goat, he would sleep in trees hanging from his horns. And so this was a mythological creature described in China. There's also the markhor, which is the official animal of Pakistan, which is this goat with these huge spiraling horns, and is also fabled to eat snakes. In fact, I really like the markhor because the markhor, when it chews up its cud, it makes this foaming cud that spits out, and some people believe that the foaming cud can be used as cures for snake bites. And also, there in the Hindu Khmer creation myth, there's this big idea around a snake and a serpent. And so all these ideas, these influences of this mythological goat that would sleep in trees by hanging from his horns, these Pakistani goats with these twisted horns that were believed to eat snakes that, by the way, they don't. That's just another myth. And just the religion all cumulated into this local belief of these Kting Voars. And the locals, they would make these horns, as almost as art pieces and to be used as medicine. This belief as part of this mythology of being able to cure snake bites. And in Cambodia, you have these big snake problems. You have lots of venomous snakes. You have like the king cobras, for example. So snakes is a problem. And if the locals had these religious mythological beliefs as a way to cure it, great. There you go. But the scientists, they got too excited. They didn't see the cultural background of it, and they just assumed the Kting Voar to be real. And so there you go. The evidence for the Kting Voar slowly stripped away. Even the wonderful Excalibur set at the University of Kansas. Because some people do believe that there is evidence of this artificial torsion and scoring of the horns. They describe that the keratin structures are contorted and that the growth rings found on the horns are almost too perfect to be found in nature. That if they're so perfect, these growth rings that grow annually, that it must have been simply added by scoring by a person. And that the pedigree, how it's maybe came from a cow that was hunted for tiger bait, or maybe actually just came from a market that they got during the hunting trip, not sure. When the pedigree was attacked, things started to fall apart. So there you go. The Kting Voar. Do you believe that it exists? Do you believe that there is a snake-eating cow somewhere deep in the jungles of Cambodia and Vietnam? Who knows? Book a flight. Maybe you can find it. Do so, but do it carefully. That's all I can say about that. So I hope that you enjoyed this kind of technical discussion, now that I'm looking back, of the Kting Voar. And whether or not it exists. So I always love a good scientific controversy, especially when it involves a legendary creature. So I thought I had a lot of fun researching it. And now hopefully if you're in the market looking for a new favorite legendary creature, you can choose the Kting Voar, which is your favorite snake-eating cow. Oh, and with that, let's dive into the question bowl. So let's dig around in here, see what we find, what the question of the day is. Okay, here's my question. What would I do if I were invisible for a day? Whew. To be invisible for the day. Well, that's a lot of power. I mean, my problem is that my moral code prevents me from doing a lot of things that maybe other people do. I wouldn't go rob something or spy on people. No, what I would probably do is I would just have some fun. If I was invisible, I would just basically pretend to be a ghost. So I would maybe, kind of spooks, scare some people. So I would make something levitate and, freak some people out. I think that would be fun. Or the other thing I would probably do, because again, I don't want to actually do anything bad or creep up on a person or anything like that. That's weird. But I wouldn't have a problem being invisible in nature. So if animals couldn't see me, then I would probably just go and do some epic, bird watching, man. Because if the birds can't see me, I could get up really close, right? If I'm just really quiet. So I would probably go bird watching. How nerdy and lame is that? You're invisible. You can literally do anything, and I'm going to go watch some birds. Well, there you go. So if you find a way to turn invisible, let me know so I can go bird watching. And with that, I'm going to head out of here. Thanks for listening. Ciao.